All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is call protection on these callable bonds. So the way this came about is that issuers, they like having a call option on the bond because they know that if rates fall, then they're able to, in effect, refinance the loan. They're able to call that bond back and issue bonds that have a lower coupon rate at that time. So people who are selling the bonds like having a call option on the bond. But what they found was that it was difficult to sell these because the people buying the bonds don't like having that call option. They're afraid it's going to be called away from them, and they ended up being reluctant to buy these bonds, and they wouldn't pay very much for them. So issuers found that if they would put what's called call protection on the bond, that they could sell them at a better price, and it was easier to sell these bonds. And all call protection is it promises that the bonds will not be called for a specific time. And so you put, say, for example, in this example, we have 5 years of call protection. That means that I'll sell you the bond, and I cannot call it for the next 5 years. So you can be assured that that bond will not be called for the next 5 years. Now, after that, if rates are low enough, at any time, the person who issued the bond can call it back for 105% of par, which would be $1,050, but not for the next 5 years, all right? So that just made it more attractive for the people who were buying these bonds. It made it easier to sell them and to sell them at a decent price. Okay. Now, for this reason, investors often calculate and talk about the yield to call on a bond, and that just means what is my yield to maturity, assuming they're going to call it as soon as they can. So in this case, let's say, okay, well, I'm going to assume that they will call it as soon as possible, so that's 5 years from now. I have to pay whatever the price is today. Well, I've got the example continues on the next page with the price. But I'll get 5 payments of $90 coupon, $90 coupon. I'll get 5 of those, and then they're going to call it and pay me $1,050. What's my yield to call based on those assumptions? All right, my yield to maturity based on those assumptions. We call that the yield to call if you're just assuming they will call it as soon as they can. So I've got an example here of this bond. And it's selling for $1,055. It's 9% coupon, 15 years, but it's callable at 105% of par, but it has 5 years of call protection. So it cannot be called for the next 5 years. And the first question says, well, what's the yield to maturity? So to calculate yield to maturity, we just, yield to maturity does not consider the call option. So that's yield to maturity just like we've studied bonds all the way up to this point. So to calculate the yield to maturity, we're just going to calculate the yield to maturity on that bond as if the call option wasn't even there. So N is 15, the payment's 90, future value is 1,000, the price is 1,055. That goes in as negative. And if I've got everything in there right and calculate that yield, it's 8.34%. Right? Now that's yield to maturity. So yield to maturity is just, you don't consider the call option when you're calculating yield to maturity. It's defined as what you would make if you bought that bond today and you received all the promised payments all the way until the bond matures. All right, so that's yield to maturity. All right, now the next slide says, okay, but what's the yield to call in this case? And then we have to look at this and say, okay, well, if we buy this bond today, we know we'll keep it for 5 years, and if we're calculating yield to call, we're going to assume that they're going to call it as soon as they can. So that's after 5 years. Right? So in this case then, N is 5. And another thing to note is, at this point, I'm assuming they're going to call it 5 years from now. They're going to pay me $1,050 for it, 105% of par. So that's going to be the future value. Right? The payment stays the same. I assume I'm going to get 5 payments of $90. And I have to pay $1,055 for it. That's what it's selling for today. Make that negative. And calculate that. And that's 8.45. Right? That's what we would call the yield to call. You just assume that they will call it as soon as they can, pay you the call price for it. You'll collect all the coupons until then. All right, yield to call. Okay, so just another example problem here. What's going on here? You have a bond that's callable at 104% of par. The bond has 3 years of call protection left. So they can't call it for 3 years, but if rates are low enough, they will call it after 3 years. And the question says, how much would you pay for the bond today if rates are 6%? So right now, interest rates, the yield on these bonds is 6%, and you expect them to stay at 6% for at least 6 more years, meaning well past when call protection of this bond ends, you think rates are going to be 6%. And notice rates are much lower than the coupon rate, right? So that would mean they would want to call this bond as quickly as they can. And if rates are going to stay at 6%, you're thinking, well, 3 years from now, I expect rates to still be low. I think they're going to call that bond. So if I buy this bond, what I'm looking for is I'm going to get 3 payments of $90, and then they're going to pay me $1,040, and that's it. The bond will be over. They'll call it back at that point. All right. So I've got here. What price would you pay for it under those expectations? Well, N in this case then is going to be 3, because I think it's only going to last 3 more years. Once call protection is over, they're going to call it back. The I is 6. I'm saying the rates now are 6%, and I expect them to stay that way. The payment is 90. It's a 9% coupon bond. And remember now, the future value is the call price. I'm assuming it's going to be called. So $1,040 is what they're going to pay me at the end. All right, I'm going to calculate that present value. And that's B, $1,113.78. All right, so if I had this expectation, that's what I'd be willing to pay for that bond right now. So I'm not getting all of the $90 coupons, but I would be willing to pay something for this bond because I expect to get 3 payments of $90 and then a payment of $1,040. So I'd be willing to pay the present value of those payments. Okay. All right, and here's another example, and this is sort of the opposite example. I have, again, the bond is callable at 103% of par. It's got 5 years of call protection left. But in this case, the rates are 13%. So notice that the rates are way above the coupon rate. So they're paying a 9.25% coupon, but rates today are 13%. Another way to think about that is if they were to issue new bonds today, they'd have to have 13% coupons on them to sell for par. So it's a much higher rate than this coupon rate. So they'd be crazy to call this bond is one way to think about it. They'd be crazy to call it because they'd have to pay coupons of $130. If they just leave this bond out there, they're only paying coupons of $92.50. All right, so since the rates are much higher than the coupon rate, you know they're not going to call it. If you expect, or this is saying you expect rates to stay high for a long time, through the end of the, past the maturity of this bond. So in this case, you can pretty much just ignore the call option on this bond. You don't expect it to be called. And if you don't expect it to be called, what you expect to get then is 12 payments of $92.50 and then $1,000 at the end. It's not going to be called. The bond is just going to go to maturity. Okay, so if we want to find the price of that bond, N is 12, rates are 13. That goes in for I. The payment is $92.50. And the future value is just 1,000, plain old 1,000, because we just assume the bond will go to maturity, will not be called. And we can find that price, and that's $778.09. Okay, so all right. So I hope you noticed the difference between those two problems. In the previous problem here, rates were much lower than the coupon rate, and we expected them to stay that way. So that's another way of saying you expect the bond will be called as soon as they can call it. In this example, that was 3 years from now. All right, and then the next example, rates are much higher than the coupon rate, and we expect them to stay that way for a long time, past the maturity of the bond. And that's another way of saying you do not think the bond will be called. You just assume the bond will pay out its normal payments all the way until maturity. Okay? All right. Okay, so here's another example calculating the yield to call. So the yield to call. Remember, for yield to call, we're assuming they're going to call it as soon as they can. So the bond has 6 years of call protection left. That means 6 years from now, we assume they will call it. All right. When they call it, they'll have to pay $1,030 for it. The payments we'll get, we're assuming we're going to get 6 payments of $110 until then. All right. So to calculate yield to call, N is going to be 6. The payment's 110. The future value is 1,030. The call price, I'm assuming they're going to call it. And then it's selling for 1,010. We'll make that negative. Put that in for present value. Compute the yield. That's 11.14%. That's the yield to call. Okay. All right, so there's examples of those. Okay, so we're going to finish on this example. was just looking at the rate of return on investment in these bonds. So I've got two bonds here, and the bonds are exactly the same except one is callable and one is not. So this bond is not callable. So if you buy this bond, you can be sure it is going to go for 10 years, and you're going to get $110 a year for 10 years. Right now, this bond is callable, meaning that after 4 years it can be called for $1,040. Until then, though, you're going to get 4 payments of $110. Right now, so notice I said if it's called. We have to look at what we think is going to happen with interest rates to determine whether we think this will be called or not. So I've got an example here. You buy both bonds and you hold them for a year. So we buy these bonds right now, and then a year from now we're going to sell them. Right? I've even got the price here that you pay for them. So for the callable bond, I pay $935. For the non-callable, I pay $980. Right? And then it says a year later, interest rates have fallen to 8%, and everybody expects them to stay that way for at least 3 years. Right? Now that's important because when we buy the bond, it has 4 years of call protection. 1 year later, we're going to sell it. That means there's 3 years of call protection left. But people expect rates to stay at 8% for the next 3 years. Well, notice this 8% is much lower than this coupon of 11%. So in that case, I can just assume this bond will be called. So when I sell this bond, the implication is that everybody's going to expect that 3 years from now it's going to be called. So when I sell this bond, I'll have to figure the price on 3 years with the payments of $110 and then a future value of $1,040. All right, that's kind of what I'm saying here with part one. Find the price you'd sell it for. It will be called in 3 years because rates are much lower than the coupon rate. And then remember, 1 year from now, I'm going to sell it and get the price I sell it for. I'll collect the coupon payment, $110, and I'll divide it by the price I paid for that. That'll give me the rate of return. So I think I can do that on the calculator here to show you this. So we're talking about the callable bond here. Rates are low, so I assume it's going to be called. Now, I know students sometimes get confused with the timeline here, but what happens is this is the scenario when I buy the bond, and then 1 year later I'm going to sell it. So 1 year later, the call protection will only have 3 years of call protection left, right? So when I sell the bond, and rates are low, I'm assuming it's going to be called. So N is 3. The interest rates are 8. The payment's still $110. And then I'm assuming it's going to be called for 104% of par, so that's $1,040 is the future value. Right? I think I've got everything in there to calculate the price that I would pay for it today. And that's that. I'm going to change the sign on that and store it in memory 1. Okay, and in fact, I'm doubting myself here. Let me just make sure I did that right before I lead you astray. So N is 3. The payment's $110. It's going to pay $1,040 at the end because I'm assuming it's going to be called because the rates are low. I got the payment in, got N in. The interest rate is 8, and I'll calculate that price, and that looks like the same price I had before, right? Yes, okay, so I'm going to go with that price. Okay, so now I'm going to sell it for that price, and then I'm also, after 1 year, I'll collect a coupon payment, so I'm going to add $110 to that price, and that's the total amount of money I would collect from a 1 year investment in that bond, right, assuming interest rates are 8% when I sell it a year from now. Okay, and then I'm going to divide it by the price I paid for it. It's $935, and subtract 1 will give me the rate of return. All right, I'm using that equation there. And that's 30.38%, yes, so D is the answer here. All right. Now the trick there is just to look at the rates, and you have to determine, is this thing going to be called or not? And if it is going to be called, then you go to the end of call protection. That'll be your N, how many years of call protection are left. Your future value will be the call price, and you can find the price you'll sell it for there. Okay, and then I think the next question says, okay, what's the holding period return on the non-callable bond? Well, remember, this is easier now. I'm just going to say, okay, well, this doesn't have a call option, so it doesn't matter. It's not going to be called. Now, I pay $980 for it today. A year from now, I'm going to sell it. The one thing I have to keep in mind is that a year from now, N will be 9, not 10. Okay, so I'm going to put in N is 9. The rates are 8. It pays me $110, that's the payment, and $1,000 is the future value. And I'll calculate that present value. It's that much, all right? So I'm going to change the sign on that. I'll add a coupon payment to it, so I'm filling in the numerator here. So there's a total amount of money I got from that bond over 1 year, and then I'll divide it by the price I paid for it, $980, and subtract 1. And that gives me a return of 32, so I guess the answer here is A, 32.39%. All right? So this was just designed to show you the difference between how you do these calculations when bond is callable and you expect it to be called and then not callable. All right? So the answer here is A. Okay, so that's the end. That's the last of these bond valuation problems. So I've got, I know, 2 quizzes posted. I'll try to post some more practice problems for you. I think I have some handouts posted already, but I'm going to look at that now. And I'll try to put up some practice quizzes if I can for you. And just get ready for the exam. Let me know if you have any questions. And then after that, stocks, we'll talk about stocks will be the next topic that we talk about. So we've done time value of money, bonds, and then we'll go to stocks next.